Meredith Caldwell had lived in the same house for 43 years. It was a narrow, two-story colonial on a tree-lined street where the maples turned gold every autumn and the sidewalks still held the chalk ghosts of children long grown. The paint on the porch rail had peeled in thin, tired streaks, and the doorbell rang half a second late, but Meredith liked it that way. Every creak in the floorboard spoke to her. Every window carried a memory. Her husband Harold used to joke that the house remembered more than either of them ever could. Harold had been gone for 6 years now. 6 years since the hospital room smelled like antiseptic and rain. 6 years since his hand had gone slack in hers. 6 years since the world had quietly decided Meredith Caldwell was no longer a full person, just a problem to be managed. She was 78 now. Her hair, once dark and thick, had softened into silver waves she pinned back each morning. Her hands trembled slightly when she poured tea, but her mind was sharp. Sharper, in fact, than it had ever needed to be before. Because now she was watching her own children plan her disappearance. David came every Tuesday. He would sit at the kitchen table, never removing his coat, scrolling through his phone while Meredith fussed with the kettle. He didn't look around the room anymore, didn't notice the framed photos or the lace curtains she washed by hand. He spoke in sighs, in clipped phrases, in that tone people used when they believed patience was a favor. "Mom, the house is too much for you." Susan came on Fridays. Susan inspected things. Dust on shelves, food expiration dates, the thermostat. She opened drawers without asking. Once Meredith caught her photographing the living room on her phone. "For what?" Meredith asked gently. "In case," Susan replied. In case of what was never said aloud. The first time Meredith heard the word facility, it was spoken like kindness. "There's a place," Susan said one afternoon, folding her arms. "Clean, affordable, they handle everything." Affordable. Meredith smiled then. She always smiled. "Oh, I'm not going anywhere," she said lightly. "Harold built this place for us." David exchanged a look with Susan. A look Meredith noticed. The neglect crept in quietly after that. Missed phone calls, groceries that never arrived, medical appointments forgotten. David stopped fixing things around the house. The porch light burned out and stayed dark. When Meredith slipped on the stairs and bruised her hip, Susan scolded her for not being careful enough, never asking if she was hurt. And then came the sorting. Meredith returned from a doctor's appointment one afternoon to find her living room rearranged, boxes stacked by the door, her mother's china wrapped in newspaper, her wedding albums missing from the bookshelf. Susan stood there with a clipboard. "We're just organizing," she said. "It's easier this way." Meredith felt something cold settle in her chest. They weren't helping her prepare. They were preparing to remove her. That night, Meredith sat alone at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold. The house creaked softly as if breathing with her. She thought of Harold, of how he used to watch quietly before speaking, how he trusted observation more than words. And for the first time in years, Meredith decided to do the same. She began paying attention. David's impatience sharpened whenever finances were mentioned. Susan's questions about the house insurance grew oddly specific. They asked about wills, about end-of-life preferences, about whether Meredith remembered signing certain documents years ago. She remembered everything. What she didn't remember, what troubled her deeply, was Harold ever mentioning that they were struggling financially. Yet David spoke as if money were tight. "We'll need to sell the house eventually," he said, too casually. "Care isn't cheap." Meredith nodded. But that night, unable to sleep, she went to the old filing cabinet in the basement, the one Harold had insisted on locking, even though she'd teased him about it for years. The key was still taped beneath the bottom drawer. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside were folders she had never seen before. Trust documents, bank statements, account numbers, balances that made her heart pound so loudly she had to sit down on the basement steps. $2.7 million, hidden carefully, structured meticulously. Meredith did not confront them. That was the first thing she decided. Harold had never confronted storms either. He had reinforced the house quietly long before the clouds arrived. So Meredith became agreeable. She nodded when Susan spoke. She asked David for advice she did not need. She allowed them to believe the sorting of her life was proceeding exactly as planned. "It's probably for the best," Meredith said one afternoon, her voice thin and tired on purpose. "I don't want to be a burden." Susan's shoulders visibly relaxed. David smiled for the first time in months. From that moment on, they moved faster. Susan brought pamphlets for assisted living facilities, always the same one, a squat gray building on the edge of town marketed as budget-conscious care. Meredith noticed the lack of windows in the photos, the fine print about shared rooms, limited visitation. David talked about transition timelines, about power of attorney, about how much easier it would be if Meredith stopped handling her own accounts. Meredith listened. She asked questions that sounded confused. "So many papers," she murmured once. "I don't know if I can keep up anymore." Susan placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "That's why we're here." But Meredith had already begun moving in silence. The next morning, she called the number printed on one of Harold's trust documents. Her voice was calm, polite, precise. The attorney on the other end paused when she gave her name. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said slowly, "we've been waiting for you." That single sentence told her everything. Over the following weeks, Meredith met with professionals her children had never known existed: attorneys, a financial advisor, a geriatric specialist recommended not by Susan, but by the attorney, someone whose reputation was built on courtroom testimony. Every appointment was scheduled during the hours Susan assumed Meredith was resting. Meredith dressed carefully for each one, not frail, not confused, composed. The geriatric evaluation took 4 hours. Memory tests, logic problems, scenario reasoning, medical imaging, psychological assessments. Meredith passed every single one. The doctor leaned back in his chair afterward, brows knit. "Has someone suggested you're incompetent?" Meredith hesitated just long enough to let the question linger. "They've suggested I'm tired," she said softly. He nodded. "I'll document everything." Meanwhile, at home, the performance continued. Meredith allowed Susan to book a tour of the facility. She even walked through it. The smell hit her first, bleach and something sour beneath it. A television blared in the corner of a common room where residents stared blankly at the screen. A nurse spoke sharply to an old man who moved too slowly. Susan watched Meredith carefully, waiting for tears. Meredith clasped her hands. "It's modest," she said. Susan smiled tightly. That night, Meredith cried, but not for herself. She cried for how easily her children had decided she belonged there. The guardianship papers came 2 weeks later. David brought them himself, sliding the envelope across the table as if it were a business contract. "This is just a formality, Mom." Meredith didn't open it. Susan spoke quickly as though rehearsed. "It gives us authority to help you, temporary, just until everything is settled." Meredith looked at the envelope, then at their faces, and nodded. "I trust you," she said. They left that evening convinced they had won. The next morning, Meredith's attorney filed a response. The court date was set. When Susan received the notice, she called screaming, "You went behind our backs!" Meredith let the silence stretch. "I thought that's what families do, help each other." By the time they realized Meredith wasn't confused, it was too late.
Bank access had been secured, accounts consolidated, assets protected. The money, Harold's shield, was now fully in Meredith's control. David stopped calling. Susan started threatening. They accused her of
Meredith had expected the courtroom to feel intimidating. High ceilings, dark wood, the weight of judgment pressing down like a physical thing. What she hadn't expected was how familiar it felt. Not because she had been there before, but because she recognized the dynamic immediately. This was just another room where people assumed she was weaker than she was. David sat stiffly beside Susan, his jaw tight, his knee bouncing under the table. Susan clutched her purse like armor. They'd barely looked at Meredith as she took her seat across from them, her posture straight, her hands folded calmly in her lap. The judge entered. Formalities followed, and then Susan's attorney began. He spoke gently, sympathetically. His tone was practiced. He described Meredith as confused, as vulnerable, as at risk of exploitation. He spoke of missed medications, of falls, of forgetfulness. Meredith listened without reacting. When the attorney referenced her declining cognitive abilities, she noticed Susan nod subtly. Then it was Meredith's turn. Her attorney stood. He did not begin with emotion. He began with evidence. Medical records were entered into the record, recent, comprehensive, undeniable. Cognitive assessments, physician testimonies, geriatric valuations, each one stating clearly that Meredith Caldwell was fully competent and capable of managing her own affairs. The judge leaned forward. Susan's smile faltered. Then came the witnesses. Meredith's longtime neighbor testified first how Meredith still drove herself to church, organized community events, remembered birthdays, managed her home without assistance. A former co-worker of Harold's spoke next. He described Harold's meticulous nature, his foresight, his concerns years ago about how people sometimes treated aging parents as assets instead of humans. Then the financial advisor took the stand. He explained the trusts, how they had been structured, why they had been hidden, and most importantly, who controlled them. The funds, he said clearly, belong exclusively to Mrs. Caldwell. David's attorney objected, overruled. Susan whispered something urgently to her brother. Meredith did not look at them. Finally, Meredith herself was asked to speak. She stood slowly. No trembling, no confusion. She looked at the judge, then briefly, just once, at her children. I raised them to be strong, independent, capable. Her voice did not waver. I did not raise them to decide when I stopped being a person. The courtroom was silent. She spoke of the neglect, the sorting of her belongings without permission, the facility tour she had never requested, the guardianship papers presented without explanation. I agreed, she said quietly, because I wanted to understand how easily love can turn into control. Susan shook her head. David stared at the table. The judge asked one final question. Mrs. Caldwell, do you feel you require assistance in managing your affairs? Meredith met his gaze. No, I require respect. The ruling was swift. The guardianship petition was denied in full. The judge warned David and Susan against further attempts without substantial evidence. He reminded them, firmly, that misuse of the court system to seize control of a competent adult's life was not taken lightly. As the gavel struck, something broke. Susan stood abruptly, tears spilling over, rage cracking through her composure. You manipulated everything, she hissed. Meredith gathered her coat. I learned from your father, she said softly. David did not follow them out. Outside, the air felt sharper, cleaner. Meredith stood on the courthouse steps and breathed deeply. For the first time in years, no one was steering her anywhere. No one was deciding for her. Behind her, her children faced consequences they had never anticipated. Their access to money they assumed existed, vanished, their certainty gone. And Meredith walked away without looking back. The silence afterward was unfamiliar. No phone ringing, no reminders, no voices correcting her choices. Meredith returned to the house alone that afternoon. The same house that had felt smaller and smaller under her children's watchful eyes now seemed to expand again, as if relieved. She sat at the kitchen table and let the quiet settle. Within days, the messages began. David called first. His voice was restrained, carefully neutral. He asked how she was doing. He suggested starting fresh. He did not apologize. Meredith listened. "I'm doing well," she said. "I hope you are too," and ended the call. Susan waited longer. When she finally came, it was not with warmth, but desperation. Her marriage had been strained by expectations she had quietly made. Bills had been counting on inheritance that never came. The lifestyle she assumed was guaranteed had been built on money that was never hers. She accused Meredith of cruelty, of abandonment. Meredith did not argue. She had learned that some people only recognize loss when it becomes personal. Within 3 months, Meredith sold the house, not because she had been forced, because she chose to. She moved into a light-filled senior apartment overlooking a small park. No stairs, no shadows, no history weighing on the walls. She bought furniture she liked, curtains in a color Harold would have teased her about, bookshelves that reached the ceiling. She hired help, but on her terms. With the money Harold had protected, she traveled. Paris in spring, Florence in autumn, a quiet coastal town in Portugal where no one knew her story. She ate slowly, walked freely, laughed with strangers. She wrote postcards she never sent. Sometimes she thought of David and Susan, not with anger, with clarity. Love, she realized, that comes with conditions is not love, it's a transaction. Harold had known, and now she did too. On her 80th birthday, Meredith sat on her balcony as the sun dipped behind the trees. She felt no bitterness, only strength. Because she had not just protected her money, she had protected herself. And that, she understood, was the inheritance that mattered most.